Most leadership conversations focus on success. This one, episode 91, From Struggle to Strength, focuses on adversity. One of the patterns I've noticed across more than 100 episodes is that challenge often reveals strengths we didn't know we possessed. That's why I wanted to bring this conversation back. Please enjoy this encore presentation of the People Dividend Podcast, episode 91. Welcome to this episode of the People Dividend Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Horne, and I am absolutely delighted to be in the studio today with Therese Miclot. And the theme of what we're exploring in today's episode of the People Dividend Podcast with Therese is the human side of leadership. I think what's McGregor wrote about a long time ago in terms of the human side of leadership, but the issues of empathy, clarity, and authenticity, they don't just transform workplaces, but they transform lives. And I think that's the story that we'll hear from Therese Miclot today. She is a leadership development expert. She brings over 2 decades of experience coaching leaders at Fortune 500 companies and startups. And her passion for leadership is deeply personal. And that's where we're going to start. But it was rooted in her own family's experiences with poor leadership. I'm going to ask her to talk about that and how that shapes her experience around empathy, clarity, and authenticity. But today she's the boss at Therese Miclot, LLC. She is a leadership consultant, and she's also co-author of The Facilitation Advantage. Therese, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Mike. I'm excited for this conversation.
Okay, so let's dig right into it. Your story about your mother's experience with poor leadership is so powerful. It's clear that it shaped your mission to help leaders lead with empathy and authenticity. Something I know a little bit about. Like in my first book was Integrity by Design: How to Working and Living Authentically. But for many of our listeners, many of whom are leaders themselves, what's the biggest lesson you've learned from about how leadership impacts people's lives, both at
Sure.
work and at home?
Yes. Well, I think all of us have an experience with a bad boss. I don't think I've met anybody who has worked at all and doesn't have some experience with a boss that left them drained, unclear, confused, frustrated. And that was woven into me at an early age. So you mentioned my mom, and my story is that my mom had to raise 3 teens, myself being one of them, after my father passed away with very little education or experience, and so had to find a job. And I watched my mom come home every day, defeated, deflated, anxious, and it always struck a curiosity in me about, well, what makes good leaders? And I also had to get a job, as my brother and sister did, and I worked at the library. And that's where I came across a pamphlet, a career pamphlet on industrial organizational psychology. And I think I was 15, and I read this pamphlet, and I said, this is what I'm going to do. This is the area of interest, because I was fascinated by the psychology of how leaders become leaders and what differentiates those that are worthy of our followership, so to speak, and those that we want to repel from and forget.
Boy, that's for sure. And true enough, all of us have experience with bad leaders. And for
Yeah.
many, they're able to take those lessons and to use them to improve and to get better. That's what I often say,
Mhm.
that, following one of my mentors, I fix individuals, teams, and groups
Yeah.
from some problematic behaviors. But let's get back
Mhm.
to your leadership philosophy,
Sure.
Therese. And you've
Yeah.
said that leadership isn't about power or process, it's about people. Can you
Yeah.
share an example of a leader who truly embodied this philosophy and the impact that he, she, or they had?
Yeah, I have several leaders that have stood out in my life. And what I would say is, the best leaders are those that know how to balance the strategy of the business, the priority of the business with people, because I think you need
Mm,
both. Like, I think you can't just rely on people because you're also there to, achieve some outcome for a company. And the best leaders that I have worked for and with tend to look at the leadership skill as skills, meaning that oftentimes the people I've worked for that I've wanted to emulate come from a area of expertise, engineering, finance, marketing, HR. But what they learned along the way was that in order to be a really effective leader, your raw intelligence isn't enough. That you have to develop a series of skills, just like learning to ride your bike or learning to cook. And so the philosophy of treating it as a set of skills and not just coming along with a title is what I have seen in my career that is the most effective because it meets in the middle of what's the need and the priority for the business along with what's the need and the priority for people.
Yes, I was always one statement that an executive with whom I worked impacted me significantly was he said, if we could figure out a way to make money without people, we would.
Yeah.
And it really goes to your point that leadership is a skill, and
Yes.
that having that skill goes to making money. And in
Yeah.
your book, The Facilitation Advantage, you
Mhm.
emphasize empathy,
Mhm.
clarity, and effectiveness, that combination.
Yeah.
Why are these three qualities, empathy, clarity, and effectiveness, if you
Mhm.
consider effectiveness a quality, as I might, why do you think these three qualities are so critical for leaders today?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, because I think it does balance their technical skill or their functional skill with the people side. And I'll offer that the term facilitate because I think a lot of your listeners might think, "Well, I'm not a facilitator." But the Latin root of the word facilitate is to make things easier.
Hmm.
And I think most leaders today have that job. Make it easier for people to adapt to change. Make it easier for their board of directors to say yes to their plan. Make it easier for them to help an organization adopt a new technology or enter a new market. I don't know any leader who doesn't have that as a responsibility to make things smoother and simpler for progress to happen. That's why I think facilitation skills are essential because in being able to create a space where people can talk honestly, where you can address issues up front and not, the meeting after the meeting, so to speak, you can move faster. And I think that all leaders are struggling with this, idea of there's a lot to get done in a short period of time. And how do I do that by bringing people along instead of dragging them along?
Yes, facilitation to make things easy. Often in
Mhm.
my coaching work with executives, I work with them on one important practice, and that's saying hello. To your
Mm.
earlier point, we often just see a person in front of us as an element of production, as
Mhm.
opposed to somebody who has unique hopes and aspirations and challenges. And, of course, I mean, we don't know what happened to them 5 minutes before we met with them, nor do we know what will happen to them 5 minutes
Yeah.
after. But it's this
Right.
ability to be present and to be focused and to bring these issues of empathy, clarity, and effectiveness. I just want to
Right.
key in on empathy a little bit.
Sure.
Given the example that I offered about seeing people as element of productions following from your experience and your story.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
Sometimes, how do leaders balance this need for empathy
Mhm.
with the pressure to deliver results? I mean, we've
Yeah.
seen an erosion of middle management in many
Right.
organizations. People
Yes.
are doing more with less, at least in a perceptual
Right.
way.
Yes.
So, how do you balance empathy with
Mhm.
pressure?
Well, I think that it rests on the skill of being a really good listener. And I think that most of us have not developed that skill. I never learned it in school. I never in grad school. I don't know where it's taught. And I think the balance of empathy with what, the business might need requires you to be able to first hear and understand people. And in the book, we talk about a really advanced skill called restating. And that's verbalizing your understanding of another person's perspective. It's not saying, I understand and move on. It's not assuming you understand and just fast forward to your needs. but it's the lubricant to really effective conversations with people. And here's the thing, restating isn't agreement. So let's say, you're in charge of implementing a new software or new process, and people don't like it. And for you to just sell the features of it, for instance, won't always get people to buy in. What they need is for you to understand that this is hard, that this is requiring a change. Now, you're not going to avoid implementation, but when people feel heard and understood, they are more likely to hear and understand you. And I find that a lot of tension that happens day to day is because there's this assumption that we understand each other and we don't.
Yes. It's to my earlier point of saying hello. And I'll just reinforce that with another lesson. One of my mentors, EDC Shore, a pioneer in the contemporary practice of organization development. Her teacher was Doug McGregor. And when she recounted Doug's experiences in organization development, because I've often
Mhm.
struggled with what's the relationship to my executive development coaching practice and my
Mhm.
organization development work, McGregor talked about coaching as foundational to
Mhm.
organization development. And he identified that the key skill he had in being financially successful was
Mhm.
his ability to listen, and that
Oh,
maybe to an engagement, you only brought one good idea. So
yeah.
that's sort of what, I set the bar there about bringing at least one good idea to an engagement. But the feedback that I get certainly from clients and others
Yeah.
is this ability to really deeply listen.
Yeah.
And to your point, that means so much more than restating. But, let's think about all the change. I mean, we're no longer in the Roosevelt Muscana era of men and women in the corporation. The
Mhm.
workplace has changed so much in recent years. Remote
Yeah.
work, COVID has its lasting impacts, the decline in employee engagement, the continuing decline in
Mhm.
engagement, more
Mhm.
presence of different generations in the workplace, a
Yes.
changing focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. What do you see
Mhm.
as the biggest challenges that leaders face today, aside from producing results for their
Yeah.
economic results for the various
Sure.
stakeholders?
Well, I think the underlying factor of all of that is a leader's ability to accelerate people through change, no matter what it is. All we know is that the rate and pace of change is just continuing to accelerate. And I think it is the one skill, along with listening, that if your listeners are going to double down on a couple things to grow their leadership capability, it's listening and it's learning how to help let people acknowledge their losses with change, because it's always
Hmm.
a loss, and and move to new beginnings, which I think one of the best books ever written about this was from William Bridges,
Oh, sure.
called
I
Managing
studied with
Transition.
Bill. I'm certified in all of Bill's
Oh,
transition.
wow. Oh, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Hmm.
Well, then we both know how, I think, transformative his approach was, and I think it is evergreen, uh, because it's just what is lacking in terms of leadership. We can make good decisions about changes, integrations, mergers and acquisitions, but we forget to think about the people side of change.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, being a certified Bridges person, and uh, you know, the way that Bill ran the certification was in two sort of components. One was the management of individuals in transition, and then the other
Mhm.
was the management of organizations in transition.
Mm. Mhm.
And it provides a rich context, I think, for understanding that, as he used to use a story. I'll
Mhm.
repeat it. You're familiar with the cartoon strip Peanuts, right? And he
Yes.
would often, because Bill was all about transition and not
Yeah.
so much about holding on or being so afraid of a new future that you couldn't embrace it. But it was that
Right.
period of transition that gets all of us in
Yeah.
opportunity for learning and exploration and trouble.
Mhm.
Um, he would relate the story of Peanuts. He would say, think about transition as when the character Linus, the little kid who always carries his bike
Mhm.
around, has that
Yeah.
dryer in the laundry somewhere, right in the laundry cycle
Mm.
process, and that's what it's like to be in a period.
Yeah.
So to think about it as a tremendous opportunity for growth, a learning for most adults isn't very fun, but
Mhm.
something that we do if we want to continue. So I'm really thinking about, given all of the issues that we explored about remote work, generational shifts,
Mhm.
what you just described, for leaders who are still struggling to connect with their teams,
Mhm.
often a misalignment issue,
Mhm.
especially in hybrid or remote work settings.
Yeah.
What's a practical step that they can take to foster one practical step to foster a more
Mhm.
supportive, inclusive environment?
Yeah. Well, I would distill it down to how you ask questions.
Hmm.
Because I think that the way you ask questions cracks open a lot of insight and information, or it keeps that door closed. And I often will coach a lot of leaders where I notice that the forms of their questions are just simply, does anybody have any questions? And that doesn't invite people who may have a contradictory point of view to express it. And so it's really small, but it's really impactful if you can plan your questions in advance. So, for instance, instead of just saying, okay, does anybody have any questions about this change? You might ask something that's more curious, like, uh, I know this is new news and you're still processing. How are you thinking about this right now? That's different than, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I'm always a
And
big believer in the power of the open-ended, focused question. What are
yes,
2 or 3 ways this might slow our progress? What are two or
yes,
three ways that this might
right.
make us move in an accelerated fashion? I'm a big fan of the
Exactly.
open-ended closed question.
Yeah. And I think we just wing it, honestly. We don't think about that when we're heading into a meeting or a presentation. And we maybe just expect, oh, well, people just, if people have questions, they'll ask me those. But I don't think that's true when you're remote and you don't necessarily, you don't have body language as much to read, or you may not have as strong of a relationship where people might second guess whether or not you're going to be open to hearing a different point of view or a different idea. I also think that a helpful way to improve your questions is to give context to why you're asking them. So, for instance, if, and I've sadly, Mike, I've done this to a direct report. I'll, running from meeting to meeting, I'm busy, I'm not really thinking. And I say to one of my direct reports, hey, can you see me in my office? Well, this person walks into my office, blood drained, and said, are you firing me? And I said, oh, no, why would you think that? And because she was assuming where that question was coming from. And I think we're moving so fast these days that we assume we know why people are asking. I was working with a continuous improvement person, and he said this was an epiphany for him because he would constantly ask people, why did you do it that way? That would put people on the defensive. But what he was trying to get at was, I'm looking at how various people are approaching this process, and I'm trying to get to what's the best way to create a standardization. Well,
Hmm.
that's not how people would interpret that question. And so they wouldn't tell him much. And I think that is the number one thing I would say is plan your questions, be curious with your questions, and give context to why you're asking. And I just see it as night and day difference in terms of how relationships can evolve more quickly when you don't when you're not face to face even.
I totally agree, and this is where our interests in facilitation intersect. As a person who has
Yeah.
spent a lot of their career leading and facilitating people from different continents, diverse teams, important decisions. Most of my career was helps with teams forming the right kinds of questions to ask,
Mhm.
and then asking if they really wanted to know the answers to those questions. Uh, but it certainly is a way of engaging both participation and democracy in
Yes.
organizations that is so
Yeah.
pivotal to where we are today in engaging others. And certainly, I like all of the ideas that would come with the facilitation advantage, and certainly something more for listeners to explore with us.
Mhm.
Uh, so let's just summarize some of the key takeaways.
Mhm.
You reminded me and all of our audience, I think, that leadership isn't just what happens in the workplace. It's
Mhm.
about the ripple effects that it creates in people's lives. I mean, starting with your own experience,
Mhm.
working through these concepts of empathy, clarity, and authenticity. Those are when we work through those, we really create environments where people truly thrive. And isn't that ultimately our goal is to have people bring their best to what they do?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a big part of our, waking lives, right? Is working in organizational settings or working with others, and there's a way to make the tension-filled moments, fade away.
So, yes, so good. And just as we think about some actionable advice for those in our audience, I mean, where can listeners find your book, The Facilitation Advantage? Where can they learn more about your work?
Yeah. Yes. So go to thefacilitationadvantage.com. So all one word. You'll find also a free assessment there. And because we wrote the book for busy leaders, and we know most people don't even read cover to cover. And you can quickly assess, where do I need to improve? Maybe that's how you manage meetings. Maybe that's how you present. Maybe that's your self talk. Maybe that's the messages you're sending yourself. Maybe it's listening. Then you can dive right into that area of the book so you get what you need, and it's very practical. So you can put it into use the very next meeting.
That's great. And, you've spent decades coaching others, as we said in the beginning. And I'm curious, though, what's the most important leadership lesson you've learned yourself? Or
Mm.
maybe thinking about it a different way, if you could go back in time 20 years,
Hmm.
what would you say?
Yeah. I think that it all starts inside. So before we can start managing other people or improving performance or having difficult conversations, we have to manage the voice in our head.
Mhm.
And whether that is an imposter, imposter syndrome that's telling us negative messages or not supporting whatever goal we have, I believe that you've got to work on your inside voice first before you can work on anything else, because it's like a billboard on your forehead. Even when you don't think you're saying it, or you are projecting it, and that's the first place to focus.
Boy, so true. And certainly something that I advise many is that in order to be an effective leader, you got to be comfortable in your own skin. And that
Yeah,
doesn't mean
exactly,
that you
Mike.
don't, bring your biases and assumptions, but it
Hmm.
means you own them in a way, and that you learn and grow from your experiences.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think it's
I
so important. Well,
I think also, I'll
yes,
just say one other thing about that.
yes, Therese
If
Miclot,
you're
please.
not if you're not sure where to begin, then start with curiosity, because curiosity is the fuel for growth. So instead of walking into your meeting and thinking, "Here we go again, nothing will change, same old," that is gonna lean you in an unsupportive direction. But you could stay curious and say, "I wonder what it would take for this meeting to go differently. I wonder how people in this room are uh, aware of the impact they're making." And just curiosity alone will lean you in the better direction.
Boy, so true. Therese Miclot, thank you so much. I invite all of our listeners to connect with your work.
Yeah.
And for everyone tuning into the People Dividend podcast today, please subscribe, please leave a review, and please tune in for the next episode. And until then, everyone, stay well.